The strange thing about life is that the biggest news often arrives quietly, without warning, like a shift in gravity. You only notice when the ground feels different beneath your feet. And right now, something unusual is happening inside a family that has lived under global scrutiny for years. Not a scandal, not a lawsuit, not some political skirmish, something more human. Something people don't expect from someone who built his identity on disruption, relentless innovation, and refusing to slow down. A wedding, a personal turning point, a moment that forces even the most hardened technocrat to confront what it actually means to build a future that isn't just mechanical, but deeply human. It's easy to think of powerful people as machines. People assume they operate on pure logic, pure aggression, pure ambition, but behind every empire is a real person who, eventually, has to negotiate with time. And time is the one opponent you never defeat. You only try to outrun it. So when someone who's spent decades sprinting finally stops long enough to say, "I'm changing direction," the world should pay attention, because that shift reveals something more important than gossip. It reveals a pattern, one that has implications for how we live, work, innovate, and even understand what success actually means. So let's break it down without the tabloid noise, without the melodrama, and without the cliches. Here's the real story, the deeper mechanics, behind a late-life commitment from someone who once declared that marriage was a failed experiment, a decision to rebuild something he once believed he could never engineer. And trust me, when a person whose worldview is built on first principles thinking reverses course, you don't analyze the event. You analyze the system. This begins with the illusion that time is infinite. When you're young, you believe you can build forever. You think the world is a series of problems waiting to be solved, puzzles waiting to be cracked, mountains waiting to be climbed. But as the decades pass, the clock starts ticking louder. Not because you're afraid of death, fear isn't the motivator, but because you start recognizing the scarcity of attention. And attention, in the physics of human life, is the most limited resource we have. Even more finite than money, more finite than energy, more finite than opportunity. At some point, even the most tireless innovators hit a wall built from their own success. Endless growth becomes exhausting. Constant reinvention becomes isolating. You master every battlefield except the one that requires you to stop fighting, your own personal life. And that's where this story shifts. Because the decision to marry again at 54 isn't a retreat from ambition. It's a recalibration of priorities, based on the one metric every engineer eventually learns to respect: sustainability. You can scale a rocket, you can scale a company, you can scale a global communications network, but you can't scale loneliness. You can only ignore it until you can't. That's when connection becomes something more than sentiment. It becomes infrastructure, emotional infrastructure, the foundation that supports every other mission. And when the right person walks into your life, not the perfect person, not some idealized fantasy, but the one who sees the real, unpolished, tired human beneath the public armor, that changes your trajectory, not dramatically, quietly, subtly, the way a spacecraft shifts course a few degrees and ends up on an entirely different planet. He didn't fall into this decision impulsively. He studied it the same way he studies engineering problems, with ruthless honesty. What went wrong before? What failed? Where did the system break? Every past relationship crashed for the same reason. Work was the sun, and everything else orbited too far out to survive. You can't maintain a partnership when your calendar becomes a battlefield and your identity becomes a brand. And instead of pretending otherwise, he admitted it. He wasn't ready. He wasn't present. He wasn't willing to prioritize someone else without feeling like he was abandoning the mission. But age does something extraordinary. It rearranges your mental hierarchy. You start realizing that success is not measured by how much you build, but by how much of yourself is left after the building is done. And somewhere in that shift, he met someone who didn't want the CEO, the public figure, or the myth. She wanted the human, the flawed version, the one with doubts, fears, and unspoken regrets. And for someone who has spent decades being treated like a symbol, being seen as a person is a radical experience. That's why this marriage matters, not for the spectacle, not for the narrative, but because it represents a deeper truth, that reinvention isn't just technological, it's personal. And sometimes the hardest upgrade is internal. The critics will say it's impulsive. The cynics will claim it's doomed. That's the default script society uses for people who fail publicly more than once. But this decision didn't come from naive optimism. It came from engineering-level self-analysis. from understanding that a system only works if you build it intentionally, not out of obligation or routine. Here's the logic behind it. First, stability matters more with age. Not because you're weaker, but because you finally understand the cost of constant acceleration. You stop chasing noise and start looking for signal, and a strong partnership becomes the ultimate signal. Second, accountability is stronger when it's official. A marriage isn't just emotional, it's structural. It forces clarity, responsibility, transparency. You can't ghost your problems. You confront them because the framework demands it. Third, with complexity comes the need for simplicity. When your life includes multiple children, companies, obligations, and public scrutiny, formal commitment provides order. It's not romantic, it's rational. Fourth, shared intention outweighs history. What matters isn't who you were at 30, it's who you're becoming at 50, and growth is not a betrayal of who you used to be. It's the point. So when he decided to get married again, it wasn't an emotional gamble. It was a systems update. A new version of himself, more balanced, more patient, more willing to build something personal with the same intentionality he brings to rockets and AI. And this upgrade is already reshaping his life. Work is shifting, not slowing, shifting. Delegation is no longer a compromise, it's a strategy. He's realizing that a company's strength is measured not by how much its founder controls, but by how much it thrives without constant intervention. That's evolution, that's scale, time is shifting. Instead of squeezing moments between chaos, he's dedicating real time to connection, mornings, evenings, shared experiences, memories built intentionally rather than accidentally. This isn't weakness, it's design. The strongest systems are built with redundancy. Not because failure is expected, but because balance is smart, priorities are shifting. The mission continues, but the hierarchy is different. The relationship becomes central, not peripheral. And that shift doesn't diminish ambition. It stabilizes it. And perhaps the most surprising shift, the future is no longer defined purely by technological inheritance, but human legacy. Not just in terms of companies, but companionship. Not just innovation, but life. That's why the wedding itself will be small, simple, private. Because when you've lived a life in front of cameras, the most valuable thing becomes what the cameras don't see. Something real, something intimate, something grounded in meaning rather than performance. This isn't a man reinventing marriage, it's a man reinventing himself. And maybe that's the lesson we're supposed to pull from this, not the gossip, not the surprise, but the blueprint. That change is possible even after repeated failure. That growth is not limited by age. That love is not disqualified by history, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't launching rockets or building empires, it's allowing themselves to be fully human. So here's the deeper takeaway. We are not defined by our past patterns. We are not prisoners of our old identity. We are not locked into the failures of our 20 seconds, 30 seconds, or 40 seconds. We evolve, we adapt, we upgrade. And the most meaningful innovations of our lives aren't the ones made in labs or factories. They're the ones made in our own mindset. If you've ever felt like you missed your chance, like you're too old to change, like the story is already written, remember this moment, because it proves something powerful. Reinvention is always possible. And the future isn't reserved for the young. It belongs to anyone brave enough to rewrite their operating system. Thanks for watching. If you want more bold, honest, future-focused breakdowns like this, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Future Focus for the next chapter.